Hello, my friend. Welcome back. Tonight, I have a different kind of winter story for you. A story about a quiet road, a lonely cabin, and a light that appeared only after midnight. So, make yourself comfortable. Let your head rest gently against your pillow. Take a slow breath in and gently breathe out. You don't need to go anywhere tonight. You don't need to think about tomorrow. Just listen and let the story begin. It was a cold January night. You were driving home through the mountains. Snow covered the road, and the trees stood quietly beneath the winter sky. There were no houses nearby, no streetlights. Only the soft sound of your tires on the snow. You checked the time, 12:18 a.m. You were almost home. Then, your headlights suddenly flickered. Once, twice, and went completely dark. You slowly pressed the brakes. The car stopped. You looked through the windshield. Nothing but snow and darkness. Then, far ahead, you noticed a small light between the trees. A warm yellow light. You stared at it. It didn't move. It simply waited there, quietly, like someone had left a lamp burning in the middle of the forest. You stepped out of the car. Cold air touched your face. Snow fell softly onto your coat. You looked back at your car, then toward the light. For some reason, you felt strangely calm. You began walking, one slow step at a time, through the quiet snow. After a few minutes, the trees opened, and there it was. A small wooden cabin standing alone at the end of the road. Warm light glowed through its windows. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and beside the front door, a single lantern was burning. You stopped because beneath the lantern, you noticed something you had never expected to see. A handwritten note. You picked it up and slowly unfolded it. There were only 6 words. You were expected tonight. You stared at the message. Then, the cabin door opened by itself. The door opened slowly. Warm golden light spilled onto the snow. You stood outside, not knowing what to do. Then, you heard the soft sound of a fireplace burning inside. Crackle, crackle. The wind moved gently through the trees behind you. You looked back. Your car was still visible far down the road, but the headlights were completely dark. You turned toward the cabin again. For some reason, you felt safer inside. So you stepped through the doorway. The door closed softly behind you. Inside, the cabin was warm. A small fire burned in the stone fireplace. A wooden table stood near the window. 2 chairs were placed beside it. And on the table, there was a cup of hot tea. Steam was slowly rising from the cup. You stared at it. Someone had prepared it only moments ago. You walked closer. Then you noticed a second thing on the table. A small brass key. Beside the key was another note. You picked it up. There were only 3 words. Not yet. Wait. You looked around the room. Nothing moved. The fire continued burning. You slowly sat down in one of the chairs. Outside, snow covered the windows. The cabin felt strangely peaceful. You took a slow breath. Then, the old clock above the fireplace began to tick. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. You looked at the time. 12:30 a.m. Exactly 12 minutes had passed. Then the clock stopped. Silence filled the room. You looked toward the window. Something was standing outside in the snow. A tall figure standing completely still. You couldn't see the face. You stood slowly. The figure raised one hand and pointed toward the forest. Then, it disappeared. You walked toward the window. There were no footprints. Nothing remained in the snow. You stepped back. And then, you heard a quiet sound from upstairs. One slow footstep. Then another. You looked toward the wooden staircase. The cabin was supposed to be empty, but someone was walking downstairs. You remained at the bottom of the staircase, listening carefully. One step, then another. Creak, creak. The sound slowly came closer. You looked toward the fireplace. The flames moved gently. Everything else was silent. Then, a shadow appeared on the wall. Someone was coming downstairs. You took one slow step backward. The shadow stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a quiet voice came from the darkness. Don't be afraid. You froze. The voice sounded calm, almost familiar. A figure slowly appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was an old woman wearing a warm gray sweater and holding a small lantern. She looked at you with a gentle smile. You came earlier than I expected. You stared at her. I don't understand. She walked toward the fireplace. Then she pointed toward the empty chair. Sit down. You slowly returned to the chair. The woman placed her lantern on the table. Then she looked at the brass key. You found it. You nodded. What does it open? She smiled softly. You'll know when it's time. Outside, the wind became quieter. Snow continued falling against the windows. The woman poured herself a cup of tea. Then she looked at the clock. 12:41 a.m. You have until sunrise, she said. You looked at her. Until sunrise for what? She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the wooden staircase. Go upstairs. You stood slowly. The brass key was still on the table. You picked it up. It felt strangely warm in your hand. You walked toward the staircase. One step, then another. Behind you, the woman quietly whispered, "Don't open the blue door." You stopped. There was no blue door in sight, at least not yet. You continued upstairs, and at the end of the hallway, you saw a small wooden door. It was painted blue. You stood quietly at the end of the hallway. The blue door was completely still. A small brass handle reflected the soft light. You looked down at the key in your hand. It was warm, almost as if it had been waiting for you. You slowly stepped closer. Behind you, the floor creaked softly. You turned around. The hallway was empty. The old woman was nowhere to be seen. You looked back at the door. A faint blue light was glowing beneath it. You placed your hand on the brass handle. Then, you remembered her warning. Don't open the blue door. You hesitated. For a few seconds, you simply stood there. Then, you heard something from behind the door. A quiet sound, like someone breathing. You moved closer. The sound stopped. Silence returned. Then, 3 soft knocks came from inside. Knock, knock, knock. You stepped back. The brass key in your hand began to feel warmer. You looked at it carefully. There was a tiny number carved in the metal. 12. You had never noticed it before. Then, the blue door slowly opened by itself. A gentle golden light spilled into the hallway. You could see a small room on the other side. There was a wooden desk, a comfortable chair, and a large window covered with frost. On the desk, a single envelope was waiting. Your name was written on it. You stared at it. You had no idea who could have written it. Slowly, you stepped inside. The door remained open behind you. You walked toward the desk. The envelope was old, but the ink looked fresh. You picked it up. For a moment, you didn't open it. Then you noticed something written beneath your name. Read this before sunrise. You looked toward the window. The night outside was still completely dark. You opened the envelope. Inside, there was only one page. You began to read, and the first sentence made your heart stop. If you are reading this, then you finally found the cabin. You read the sentence again. Then, a soft sound came from behind you. The blue door had closed.
You slowly turned around. The blue door was completely closed. You walked toward it and tried the handle. It wouldn't move. You looked back at the letter. The words seemed strangely familiar. You began reading again. You may not remember me. You stopped. Your eyes moved slowly across the page. But many years ago, you stayed here. You felt a quiet chill. You had never been to this cabin before. At least, you didn't think you had. You continued reading. You were only a child. You lowered the letter. Outside the frosted window, snow continued falling. Then another sentence caught your attention. Your memory was taken for a reason. You stared at the words. Taken? You touched your forehead. For a moment, a strange image appeared. A little wooden cabin, a warm fireplace, and a child standing beside the window. Then the image disappeared. You closed your eyes. Another memory came. You were running through the snow. Someone was calling your name. Then, nothing. You opened your eyes. Your breathing became slower. At the bottom of the page, there was one final sentence. Before sunrise, you must remember why you left. You looked at the clock on the wall. 1:03 a.m. You still had several hours. Then, you heard a soft knock on the blue door. Knock. Knock. You stepped back. Another knock. Knock. This time, a quiet voice came from the other side. Are you ready? You froze. You recognized the voice. It was the old woman. You walked toward the door, but before you touched the handle, the brass key in your hand began to glow. A thin blue light appeared across the floor. It moved slowly, leading away from the door, toward the window. You followed the light, and when you reached the frosted glass, you saw something outside. A second cabin, hidden deep inside the forest. Its windows were glowing, and beside the door, someone was waiting. You stood beside the window, looking at the cabin hidden among the trees. The blue light beneath your feet slowly disappeared. You looked back at the door. The old woman was still outside, But she didn't knock again. She simply waited. You looked toward the second cabin. Something inside you told you to go. So you opened the window. Cold air entered the room. Snowflakes drifted inside. You climbed carefully onto the wooden porch. Then you stepped into the snow. The forest was completely quiet. You walked toward the second cabin. With every step, the strange feeling inside your chest grew stronger. You felt as if you had walked this path before. After a few minutes, you reached the cabin. The front door was slightly open. Warm, golden light shone through the gap. You pushed the door gently. It opened. Inside, everything was covered with a thin layer of dust. An old fireplace stood against the wall. A wooden table rested near the window, and on the wall, there were photographs. You walked closer. The first photograph showed the cabin. The second showed the frozen forest. Then, you saw yourself. You were a child, standing beside the same old woman. Your heart began beating faster. You looked at another photograph. This one showed a little girl standing beside you. She was holding a small silver bell. You stared at the picture. You didn't remember her, but something about her face felt familiar. Then you noticed a date beneath it. January 17th. You touched the photograph, and the moment you touched it, you remembered her name. You closed your eyes, and suddenly, a memory returned. You were standing beside the little girl. Snow was falling around you. She was holding the silver bell. You were both laughing. Then, you remembered her name. Emily. You opened your eyes. The old woman was watching you quietly. You remember now, she said. You looked down at the silver bell. Who was Emily? The old woman walked toward the window. She was your friend. You stared at her. But what happened to her? The old woman remained silent. Outside, the snow continued falling. Then, she pointed toward the frozen forest. Go outside. You looked at her. Why? Because she is still waiting. Your heart became still. You held the silver bell in your hand. Then, you stepped outside. The cold air touched your face. Snow covered the ground. The old woman stayed inside the cabin. You walked slowly between the trees. The silver bell made a soft sound with every step. Ting, ting, ting. Then, you heard something in the distance. A child's laughter. You stopped. The laughter came again. This time,
It sounded closer. You followed the sound. After a few minutes, the trees opened. A frozen pond appeared beneath the moonlight. And beside the pond, you saw a small wooden bench. Someone was sitting there. A little girl, wearing a red winter coat. She slowly turned toward you. You couldn't see her face clearly, but you knew it was Emily. She smiled softly and whispered, "You finally came back."
You stood quietly beside the pond, looking at Emily. For a moment, you couldn't speak. Snow continued falling around you. Emily looked exactly as you remembered her, only she seemed a little older. You took one slow step forward. "Emily," she smiled, "I knew you would remember." You looked at the silver bell in your hand. "Why did I forget you?" Emily looked toward the frozen pond. "Because you were afraid." You didn't understand. Afraid of what? She pointed across the ice. You looked carefully. At the center of the pond, a small wooden cabin stood beneath the moonlight. You had never seen it before, but somehow you knew the place. Emily stood from the bench. "That's where we made our promise." You looked at her. "What promise?" She smiled softly. "You promised you would come back." The same words from the letter. Your heart became quiet. Then a soft wind moved through the trees. The silver bell rang again. Ting, ting, ting. Emily walked toward the frozen pond. You followed her. She stepped carefully onto the ice. Then she looked back. "Come with me." You hesitated. The pond was completely frozen. The moonlight reflected across the surface. You took a careful step. The ice didn't move. Then another, and another. Soon you were walking beside Emily. The little cabin in the center of the pond was getting closer. Then Emily stopped. She pointed toward the cabin door. "It's waiting for you." You looked at the door. There was something carved into the wood. 3 simple words. "You left me here." You stared at them, and suddenly you remembered what happened that night. You closed your eyes, and the memory returned. It was many years ago. You were only a child. Snow was falling, just like tonight. You and Emily were standing beside the cabin. She was holding the silver bell. You were holding her hand. Then, you heard your family calling from the forest. It was time to leave. You told Emily you would come back, but she didn't want you to go. Promise? You smiled. I promise. You placed the silver bell inside the wooden cabin. Then you walked away. Emily stayed behind. You turned around one last time. She was standing beside the door, still waiting. Then the snow became heavier. You couldn't see her anymore. You opened your eyes. You were standing on the frozen pond again. Emily was beside you. You remembered. You looked at her. I never meant to leave you. She smiled gently. I know. Then she reached toward the wooden door. The wooden door slowly opened. Warm golden light filled the snowy night. You stepped closer. Inside, there was a small fireplace, 2 wooden chairs, and on the table, a photograph. You walked toward it. It showed you and Emily as children. You picked it up. On the back, there was a short message. Some promises wait longer than others. You looked at Emily. She smiled. Then, the silver bell in your hand began to glow. A soft golden light filled the room. Emily whispered, "Now you can let me go." You looked at her. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the window. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to appear. The night was ending, and somewhere in the distance, you heard a quiet train whistle. You stood quietly inside the little cabin, watching the first light appear beyond the trees. Emily stood beside you. The silver bell was still glowing softly in your hand. You looked at her. "Are you leaving?" She smiled. "I've been waiting for this night." You didn't understand. Then she walked toward the wooden table. There was an old photograph resting beside the fireplace. She picked it up. "This is the last thing you need to remember." You looked at the photograph. It showed the same cabin, the frozen pond, and 2 children standing beside the door. But this time, you noticed something you had never seen before. Behind the children, there was a tall woman, the same woman you had met tonight. You looked at Emily. "Who is she?" Emily smiled softly. "She helped us remember." You turned toward the door. The old woman was standing outside. Her lantern was glowing. The sky was becoming brighter. You stepped outside. Emily followed you. The snow had almost stopped. The forest was quiet. Then Emily placed the silver bell into your hand. "Keep it." You looked at her. "Why?" "So you never forget the way back." Your eyes became heavy. You wanted to say something. But when you looked again, Emily was gone. Only the soft sound of the bell remained. Ting, ting, ting. You stood alone beside the frozen pond. The old woman walked toward you. She smiled. You remembered everything. You looked at her. Was Emily real? The old woman nodded.
She always was. Then she pointed toward the forest. The road is waiting. You looked back at the little cabin. Its golden light was slowly fading. The sun was rising, and somewhere beyond the snowy mountains, a train whistle echoed one last time.
You looked toward the forest. The morning light was slowly spreading between the trees. The old woman stood beside you. She pointed toward a narrow, snowy path. This way. You followed her. Your footsteps were soft beneath the snow. For a while, neither of you spoke. Then you looked back. The frozen pond was already disappearing behind the trees. The little cabin was still visible, but its golden light was almost gone. You held the silver bell tightly in your hand. Ting, ting, ting. The sound was gentle, almost like a goodbye. After several minutes, you reached the first cabin. The door was open. Inside, the fireplace was still burning. The cup of tea was still on the table, but the old woman was no longer beside you. You looked around. Everything was quiet. Then you noticed something on the table. A small envelope. You picked it up. Your name was written on the front. You opened it slowly. Inside, there was only one sentence. Some journeys end when we remember where we belong. You read it twice. Then you smiled. You finally understood. The cabin wasn't waiting for someone to find it. It was waiting for someone to remember. You placed the letter back on the table. Then you walked toward the front door. Outside, your car was still waiting beside the road. The sun was now rising above the mountains. You looked back one last time. The cabin stood quietly beneath the snowy trees. Then, a warm golden light appeared in its window. You smiled and started walking toward your car. Behind you, the light slowly faded. The forest became silent, and somewhere far away, a small silver bell rang one last time. Ting! Then silence. You reached your car and stood quietly beside it. For a moment, you simply looked back at the forest. Everything was still. The snow was falling softly, and the morning sky was becoming brighter. You opened the car door, then stopped. Something was lying on the driver's seat. A small silver bell. You stared at it. The same bell Emily had given you. You slowly picked it up. It felt warm, almost alive. Then, you heard a faint sound behind you. Ting, ting, ting. You turned around.
There was no one there. Only the snowy road and the quiet forest. You looked toward the cabin one last time. The golden light was gone. But somehow, you didn't feel sad. You knew the journey had ended. You placed the silver bell carefully beside you, started the engine, and slowly drove away. The mountain road was quiet. Snow covered the trees on both sides. The morning sunlight touched the road. And for the first time in many years, your mind felt completely clear. You no longer wondered about Emily. You no longer wondered about the old woman. You simply remembered. And sometimes, remembering is all we need. The road slowly disappeared behind you. The cabin became smaller until it was hidden completely by the trees. You took a slow breath and continued driving home. Behind you, deep inside the snowy forest, a tiny silver bell rang once more. Ting. And then everything became quiet. The road became quieter as you drove farther away from the mountains. Snow continued falling softly, covering the trees on both sides of the road. You looked at the small silver bell resting beside you, and for some reason, it made you smile. Then your phone suddenly vibrated. You looked at the screen. There was one new message. There was no name, no number, only a single sentence. Thank you for remembering. You stared at the message for a moment. Your heart became strangely still. Then the screen went dark. You looked ahead. The road was completely empty, with only the soft glow of your headlights shining across the snow. But in the distance, you noticed a warm golden light between the trees. You slowly pressed the brakes. For a moment, you wondered if it was the cabin, but it wasn't. Beside the road stood a small wooden sign, half covered in snow. As you passed it, you looked through the rearview mirror. 3 words were written across the sign. Come back someday. You smiled softly and continued driving. The mountains slowly disappeared behind you. The snowfall became lighter, and the morning sky grew brighter. You felt tired now, but it was a peaceful kind of tiredness. You leaned back against the seat and listened to the quiet sound of the engine. The silver bell rested beside you, completely still, until ting. You looked down. The bell had moved slightly. You smiled. Then you continued driving. Somewhere behind you, deep inside the snowy forest, the old cabin remained hidden beneath the trees, quietly waiting for another winter night. And perhaps for another traveler who had forgotten something important. But your journey was over. You had remembered. You had returned. And now you could finally go home. The road stretched peacefully ahead as the morning sun rose above the mountains. You took a slow breath and drove toward the light without looking back. For the first time in many years, you felt completely at peace. The snowy road continued beneath your tires as the morning slowly became brighter. You looked through the windshield. The mountains were far behind you now. There was nothing unusual ahead, only a quiet road, soft snowfall, and the pale morning sky. You reached for the silver bell beside you. It was cold now, completely ordinary. You turned it gently in your hand. For a moment, you wondered if everything that happened during the night had been a dream. The cabin, the old woman, Emily, the frozen pond, the blue door. Everything seemed impossible, but the bell was still there. That was enough. You placed it carefully in the small compartment beside the driver's seat. Then you continued driving. After nearly an hour, you finally reached the town. The streets were beginning to wake up. A few lights were turning on in the windows. A bakery was opening its doors. People were beginning their morning routines. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. You stopped at a quiet intersection. Then you noticed something across the street. A small antique shop. Its window was filled with old clocks, photographs, and wooden objects. You looked at the display, and suddenly your heart stopped. In the center of the window, there was a photograph. You couldn't see it clearly from the car, but something about it felt familiar. You parked beside the road and then slowly walked toward the shop. The door was still closed. A small sign on the window said, "Open at 9 a.m." You looked at your phone. 8:59 a.m. You waited quietly. 1 minute later, the door unlocked. A soft bell rang above it. Ting! You stepped inside. The shopkeeper looked at you. Then his eyes moved toward the silver bell in your hand. His expression suddenly changed. "You found it," he whispered. You stared at him. Found what? The old man slowly pointed toward the photograph in the window. "You should take a closer look." You turned toward the photograph, and this time you could see it clearly. It was a picture of the snowy cabin, and standing beside it was Emily.
You stared at the photograph. Emily was standing beside the cabin, just as you remembered her. But there was something strange about the picture. You stepped closer. In the background, behind the cabin, you noticed the old woman. She was standing beside the trees, holding the same lantern. You looked at the shopkeeper. "Where did you get this?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the silver bell in your hand. Then he quietly said, "That bell belonged to Emily." You felt a chill. "But she gave it to me." The shopkeeper nodded. "I know." You stared at him. "How?" He walked toward an old wooden cabinet. From inside, he took out a small black box. Then he placed it on the counter. "You should open this." You looked at the box.
there was a tiny silver lock. The shopkeeper pointed toward the bell. "Try it." You slowly placed the silver bell against the lock. Click. The box opened. Inside, there was an old photograph, a folded letter, and a small wooden key. You picked up the photograph first. It showed two children standing beside the frozen pond. You recognized yourself, and beside you was Emily. You turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back. January 17, the same date you had seen before. Then you opened the letter. The handwriting was small and faded. You read the first line. "If you ever find this, it means you remembered." You stopped. Your hands became still. The shopkeeper quietly stepped away. You continued reading. "There is one final place you must visit." You looked at the wooden key. Then you looked back at the shopkeeper. "Where does this key go?" He pointed toward the back of the shop. "There is an old door there." You followed his gaze. At the end of the room, a narrow wooden door stood quietly in the shadows. You had never noticed it before. The shopkeeper handed you the key. "Whatever you find behind that door," he paused, "don't be afraid." You slowly walked toward it. The key felt warm in your hand, and somewhere behind the door, you heard a familiar sound. Ting, ting, ting. You stood in front of the old wooden door. For a moment, you didn't move. The shopkeeper remained behind you. The entire store was quiet. You looked down at the small wooden key. It was warm in your hand. You slowly placed it into the lock. Click. The door opened. A cold breeze moved through the room. Beyond the doorway was a narrow hallway. There were no lights, only a faint golden glow coming from somewhere in the distance. You stepped inside. The door slowly closed behind you. You turned around. The shopkeeper was gone. You looked ahead. The hallway seemed much longer than it should have been. Old photographs covered the walls. You walked closer to the first one. It showed the snowy cabin. The second showed the frozen pond. The third showed Emily. Then you stopped. The next photograph showed you. But this photograph was different. You were standing beside the cabin as an adult. The date beneath it was today's date. Your heart began beating faster. You touched the photograph, and suddenly you heard Emily's voice. "It's time." You looked down the hallway. At the very end, a blue light appeared. You slowly walked toward it. With every step, the light became brighter. Then you saw a familiar wooden door, the same blue door from the cabin. You stopped. The brass handle was glowing softly. You remembered the old woman's warning, "Don't open the blue door." But this time, you knew why you had been brought here. You reached for the handle. Before you could touch it, a soft voice whispered behind you. You came back. You turned around. Emily was standing there. She was smiling, and in her hand, she was holding the silver bell. You looked at the bell in your own hand, then back at Emily. how can you have one? Emily smiled. Because there were always two. She held out her hand. Come with me. You looked at the blue door, then looked at Emily. Slowly, you placed your hand in hers. Together, you turned toward the door and opened it.
The blue door opened slowly. Warm golden light filled the hallway. You and Emily stepped through together. On the other side was the quiet, snowy forest. The same cabin stood in the distance, glowing softly beneath the winter sky. Emily looked at you. This is where you left your memories. You walked toward the cabin. The old woman was waiting inside. She smiled gently. You finally remembered. Emily placed her silver bell beside yours. The two bells touched. Ting! You closed your eyes, and suddenly everything returned. The winter nights, the frozen pond, the laughter, and the promise you had made to Emily. You had promised to come back, and now you had kept that promise. You opened your eyes. Emily was standing beside the window. You can go home now, she said softly. Will I see you again? She smiled. Whenever you remember. The old woman opened the door. Morning light was beginning to spread across the snowy forest. You stepped outside. Before leaving, you looked back at Emily. She raised her hand. You smiled. Then you walked toward the road. The snowy cabin slowly disappeared behind the trees. The morning sun rose above the mountains. You held the two silver bells in your hand. Ting! You stopped for a moment, then smiled. You had found what you had forgotten. You had kept your promise, and now you were finally going home. The snowy road stretched peacefully ahead. Your thoughts became quiet. Your shoulders relaxed. There was nothing left to find, nothing left to fear. You were home. And somewhere deep inside the winter forest, the little cabin remained warm and quiet beneath the snow, waiting for another winter night. But tonight, your journey was finished. Take a slow breath in and gently breathe out. You are safe. You are home. Good night, my friend. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you always remember the way home.